Okay. I think we're alive, as I would say, but based on the past two attempts, I'm not sure anyone is actually going to be able to hear or see the stream. We'll see. I'll wait for some people, or at least one person, to come in and tell me if. Hey, Irene. Okay, so at least one person is here. I'm gonna take a third stab at this. Hey, Nate. See, Nate, that was the problem with the last two streams. Nate wasn't here, which is why they ended so abruptly and disastrously. Okay, so you can hear me. I'm clear and coherent, or at least clear for the time being. That's good to know. I don't know how long that'll last. Uh, keep uh, keep your fingers crossed if you're superstitious. You can pray that this lasts for more than 5 continuous seconds. Hey, Tower Time. Yeah, the last two. I don't know why the last two attempts at live streaming were a complete botch. I listened to the playback, and yeah, there were you there were little words that escaped, but other than that, it was, unless you were a lip reader, there was no way you were going to be able to understand what I was saying. And I thought it had something to do with the computer, the connection. I thought the connection was broken, so I I checked the Ethernet cable, and I looked at my computer because I thought there was something wrong there, but it turns out that I don't think that was the problem. I wish I had one of those channels that could hire, or at least or at least inveigle someone to do the technical side of things, just so that it didn't it, the just so that that things like live streams didn't come out to be complete hash. But unfortunately, it's a very low budget program you're dealing with here, so that that's that's something for the future. I am grateful that it's not that I don't have a channel that has thousands of viewers, because I was watching John Harris's channel the other day. He's he's a Christian YouTuber who does these very lengthy videos. He does a podcast called Conversations That Matter, and he does anywhere between a 40-minute long and an hour long podcast 3 times a week. So he he basically puts out 3 hours of content, scripted, some of it unscripted, but a lot of it he uses PowerPoint presentations. So it's a lot more structured than most of the videos you see coming from me. I've done somewhat structured videos. Like, of course, I did the series, the exegesis of the Quran, where I did a surah by surah. But um, even that wasn't scripted. It was very uh, loosely structured. Okay, so you're hearing me. That's great. So but he does these podcasts. Like I said, three, sometimes 4 times a week, that go on for an hour. And the other day he had to re-upload a podcast, I think 3 times. He kept I and I'm not one of those people that sits down and watches a video from start to finish. So I didn't even see the first two attempts. I saw maybe 5 or 6 minutes of them. But he had to re-upload a video 3 times before it took. And I was thinking to myself, I don't know if I could do that. if I was planning on doing a 40-minute long or an hour-long podcast, and I had to take it down every time there was some unexpected interruption or mishap, I would be uh I would be in deep doo doo. That would not be a good thing. So yeah, um the last two attempts I was basically explaining what I wanted to do um when I actually do have a somewhat or planned upload. I might live stream that, but I might also just upload a pre-recorded video, uh, uh, essentially examining the Book of Mormon, because I'm about 150, not 100. I'm approximately 350 pages into the Book of Mormon, and it it gets to be tough sledding by the time you get to the Book of Layman. I I liked reading it initially because, unlike the Quran, there is there's a structured narrative. There's a storyline, a through line that you can go to from it. But even that is sort of disjointed. I'm probably going to get to that in the video, but unlike the Quran, which is uh, analogous to sitting down and listening to a schizophrenic just talk for hours at a time, there's 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 sort of a narrative structure there, so you can you can kind of make out what the author was trying to do, but even that is very haphazard. Like there are parts of the book which jump from which there's for example, there's one section that is called the Words of Mormon, where there's a tiny chapter in the middle of the book which jumps 3 centuries and then goes right back to and later on in the Book of Layman, there even the chapters are sort of hopscotching through different time periods. And by the time you get to the Book of Layman, it's just a series of descriptions of fictitious battles between the Lamanites and the Nephites that just go on for literally hundreds of pages. I mean, there are slight diversions, but just hundreds of pages describing these fictitious battles that go nowhere. Just about the Lamanites winning battles or overcoming the Nephites and the Nephites fighting back. And it just goes on and on with no apparent no apparent endpoint. So by the time you get a couple hundred pages into the book, it just becomes mind-numbingly boring to follow the details. It's just I don't know. It's really um, there's there's a psychiatrist who has this channel where he analyzes certain prominent news stories and prominent news figures, and he'll do a psychological analysis, and he has a disclaimer at the beginning of each video, because basically stating that he's not offering a psychological analysis. He's basically just throwing out his thoughts as a psychiatrist because he has to do that for legal purposes. But he basically analyzes um, interesting news stories and particular figures, both current news figures and historical personages. he'll psychoanalyze what their motivations were and try to explain it from that perspective. And he did one for Joseph Smith where he went through the history of Joseph Smith, and then at the end appended to that his own psychoanalyses, like what was motivating this guy. And he went through he was he uh histrionic, was he schizophrenic, what impelled him to do all of these things, which was interesting, because I think it's a lot easier to look at the Book of Mormon as a constructed or fabricated tale than it is as inspired, especially when you think about some of the claims that are being made. For example, the idea that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of synagogues that existed in the Americas prior to any sort of Western colonization. So you would, in order to believe that the Book of Mormon was inspired, you would have to subscribe to the idea that there were thousands of these synagogues, these temples that existed in the United States alongside pre-existing Amerindian civilization. So you would have to believe that alongside the Aztecs and the Mayans, the Maya and the Incas and the Olmecs and Toltecs, there were also these Jewish temples that proliferated. You would have to believe that those existed, despite all evidence to the contrary. Despite the fact that there are no relics, or there's no historical proof that there was a Jewish civilization that existed in North and South America. Book of Mormon videos YouTube channel. Yeah, there's the LDS actually has a channel. That's one of the things. That was one of the reasons I was kind of skeptical of The Chosen. I didn't actually know who was. It turns out that Dallas Jenkins, I think, is the name of the. He's the son of one of the co-authors of the Left Behind series. Um, the Planet Kolob. Yeah, there's a Mormon hymn called "If I Could Hide to Kolob." I think it's set to the tune of this Irish. I think it's like an Irish um song, like an Irish folk song, if I'm not mistaken. Someone could correct me later on, but um yeah, there's which actually sounds really sweet when you listen to it sounds very melodic, but when you analyze the lyrics, it's very bizarre, but it's a prominent Mormon, and yeah, you can find that on YouTube. Um, but yeah, you would have to believe, in order to believe that it was inspired, you'd have to believe that. You would also have to believe that there was an ancient Jewish civilization or diaspora that left Israel before the destruction of the Second Temple and reconstituted itself in North America, basically. And I think that's one of the things. I'm not sure. I don't think Mormons would accept this characterization, but when you look at Mormonism, it's essentially a form of Israelism transplanted to the United States. So you have things like Anglo-Israelism, which has existed. You can you can trace the roots back, I think, to the 17th century. It's pretty old. This idea that there was an that that the English are an extant tribe or descendants of a tribe of Israel, and that concept was adopted and augmented in the United States by the what are known now as Hebrew Israelites or Black Hebrew Israelites, who believe that African Americans are descendants of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And if you ever had the unpleasant if you ever had the misfortune of having a conversation with a Black Hebrew Israelite, they would tell you that explain how they have a 12 tribes chart where they tell you, you know, this you know uh, this Caribbean tribe is the tribe of Levi, and this is the tribe of Judah, and this tribe is Gad and Naphtali, and so on and so forth. So the, the basic concept of Israelism is that these tribes these people that exist are descended from ethnic Israel, and it's one of the reasons for it is to to establish a connection for their biblical claims. And I think this is something the Mormons do. I don't know how many people have actually analyzed it from this perspective, but it really is sort of a variant of yeah, the Church of God. I think the Church of God is still around. I know I think Mike Winger, there was an apologist on YouTube who actually talked about them in one of his videos. But yeah, I think the LDS is sort of, I don't know if I would classify it as Israelism, but it's very similar when you actually break down their Joseph Smith's claim to authority. It's very similar to Israelism. This concept that you can trace Mormonism, which was a fabricated belief system that occurred in the 19th century, and um, was propounded by this guy who otherwise was known for, he was known specifically for trying to get money through treasure hunting. That was his, that was basically his vocation. He had something called a seer stone, which he ostensibly used to help people find treasure, and that was his job. So some this was a set of beliefs that was created over the course of several years by him, and the idea that he he had revelation from these tablets, these gold tablets and brass tablets. There there are a bunch of them that are described in the Book of Mormon, but these tablets that described a Jewish civilization, and he tied these beliefs to that civilization, which again, there's not there's no evidence really to support um the synagogue thing. Like there's no, putting aside some of the other fanciful claims, the idea of domestic horses in North America, like there's no evidence to support the idea that there was a Jewish civilization that existed in the Americas at this time, and there are dates at the bottom of each chapter. There are specific dates that describe when the action is being described as taking place. Um, so I think you could actually call them part of that whole strand of Israelism, and it's really a claim of authority, or a pretension to authority, what to believe things that are not justifiable otherwise. Like when you actually examine the evidence, um, and that was one of the reasons I, I I didn't watch the Chosen. Um, like I said, Dallas Jenkins I, is the creator, and I think he's the son of one of the co-writers of the Left Behind series, which is a series of novels by Tim LaHaye, and it describes the focus of it is the pre-tribulation rapture. And one of the reasons I didn't watch the series is because when I saw clips from it, it reminded me of videos and teaching materials that the Mormons had. Um, I don't know. Hopefully, sometime this month or next month by the latest. I'm almost, like I said, I'm about 350 pages into the Book of Mormon. Uh, there's another 170 pages left. It gets it gets to be a pretty tough slog by the time, like I said, after 100 pages, a lot of it is very repetitive. There's a lot of it is simply plagiarized. There are a lot of parts of it are plagiarized from the King James Bible. There like there's I know there are dozens of examples, but I think specifically one of them is Romans 5:5, where they essentially reproduce it. That they reproduce Romans 5:5, but they don't attribute it. They don't cite where it's being taken from. So there'll be a part of the Book of Mormon where they'll quote a passage from Scripture, and instead of referring back to the Bible, it'll be a citation to another part of the Book of Mormon, or it'll be a citation to another text from Joseph Smith, like Doctrines and Covenants. So you have a Bible verse, but when you look at the cross references, which are at the bottom of each page, it'll be to another Mormon book. So, and there are parts which are acknowledged, like in Second Nephi. That there's a portion of Second Nephi where the first 14 chapters of the book of Isaiah is simply reprinted. So for 14 chapters, you'll be reading what's essentially a verbatim. It's a recapitulation of Isaiah, those parts of Isaiah, and there are other parts of Isaiah which aren't reprinted in total, but there are passages from Isaiah. So a lot of it was simply cribbed from the Bible. Um, those parts are not bad, but the other than the fact that they're being plagiarized and the author is not citing where he's getting this, it's simply left to the reader to infer that these are inspired. These are inspired and were told to Joseph Smith, or told to someone who who inscribed it in tablets that Joseph Smith came across, which is really uh, it's really blasphemous when you think about it. Yeah, copy paste. It's essentially someone. It's like someone that plagiarized another person's term paper, paper. So you see these advertisements sometimes seeking people to write term papers for college students who are too lazy, who are too lazy or dumb, who are just who are too indolent to actually sit down and do the research and study and write for themselves. And that's the impression I get when I read something like the Book of Mormon. It's very it's very shoddily done, and it's not you can sort of pick out where the problems are. And I think it's useful to look at it as a text that's fabricated and and used as a guide for this belief system. Um, and in that sense, it has been useful because you do learn what you basically learn the reasons why Mormonism is constituted the way it is, and it gives you insights into the LDS community. So there are certain themes that keep recurring throughout the book that that allowed me to understand certain aspects of the Mormon community. So there's one of the heavy emphases is on keeping the commandments, and it's a very works based type of salvation. So their soteriology revolves around keeping the commandments and doing the works that are fit for God. So and one of those things is caring for the needy and the poor. And you see this reflected if you actually look at Utah, and Salt Lake City is a great example of this. So in a place like New York City, you see homelessness and it's ubiquitous. You see people, in fact, uh, about a year or so into the pandemic, I saw a man lying, and this was unique. I've never actually seen this before, but there was a man splayed completely across the stairs of the Bowling Green train station, and I don't mean at the bottom of the stairs. Sometimes you see people, homeless people, crouched into a corner, covered with blankets, or in certain nooks. I don't mean that. I mean he was actually sleeping across the stairs in the entranceway to the station, so that people had to walk around him in order to access the train at the Bowling Green station. So that's something I saw, and you see this profusion of homelessness on the subways now. Once people stopped using the subways during the first during the initial 3 to 4 months of the pandemic, subway ridership declined precipitously. So you had people essentially using the subways as makeshift domiciles. But if you go to Salt Lake City or you go to places in Utah, you see homelessness is not. I've never been there, so I'm not going to. I'm not going to claim that there are no homeless people, but it's much less of a problem. That you don't see the sort of encampments that you do in places like San Francisco or like New York, where you see homeless people everywhere. Particularly particularly in Manhattan. It's not as bad in the outer boroughs, but if you go to Manhattan, for those of you who don't live in New York City or don't visit New York City, and I wouldn't recommend visiting, especially now. Um, uh, but but there's homelessness. You don't see that in Utah, and one of the reasons is because they've made a concerted effort not to allow people to be homeless. Like in Salt Lake City, they invest a lot of resources in making sure that people who are domiciled have houses, or the people that normally would be that way have houses. They have shelter, and I think one of the reasons is the emphasis on doing good works, and one of those works is taking care of poverty stricken people. So that's one thing. That's one thing I gathered from reading the Book of Mormon, and it's something that's translated from their belief system to practical applications. So yeah, that's true. A lot of good people are deceived. Um, but that was one insight I took, and another something else that I gathered from reading the Book of Mormon, in terms of practical applications of their belief system. Something else was the fact that religious freedom is a heavy emphasis in Mormonism, and you even see that in the stories described in the Book of Mormon. So this idea of the Nephites constantly being under persecution, they're constantly being hounded and having their particular religious expression condemned, and they're attacked. They're not able to assemble freely. And again, this is something I think that, um, instead of looking at the Book of Mormon as inspired, or as looking at the events described as having actually taken place, which again, it's very hard to convince yourself that they did, unless unless you were raised in a Mormon environment. It's hard to deceive yourself into believing that these things actually took place. But looking at it as sort of a picture of what Mormon uh, culture prioritizes, it's a lot more useful looking at it that way. So this idea of religious pluralism, that's something that's very heavily emphasized in the Book of Mormon, and like I said, there are hundreds of pages that describe the internet the internecine warfare that takes place. So you have Nephites and Lamanites battling each other constantly for hundreds. Like I said, it's very repetitive. But something else that occurs is this idea, and you see this in the Book of Alma particularly, this idea of liberty and religious liberty, defending your religion. And this is something that is integral to Mormon culture, and reading the Book of Mormon gives you a deeper insight. It helps you to understand why that's so important. So in the Book of Alma, there's a description of this, of them fighting for their liberty and even having standards with liberty on it that they take up during battle. And this is something that is emphasized repeatedly. And in Mormon culture, it's important if you actually look at historically how Mormonism unfolded. It began, of course, Joseph Smith was the one who created this system of beliefs in New York, upstate New York, but he was constantly encountering problems. So he and his followers, which he gradually accumulated, went from place to place, from New York to Pennsylvania, and then to Missouri. And in Missouri, they eventually were the subject of an extermination order by the governor, and they established a city in Nauvoo, which Joseph Smith thought was a Hebrew word that I forget what he translated it as. Uh, as a side note, that's something else that's really curious, and it's it makes it hard for someone with discernment to believe this was inspired, because there are parts of the Book of Mormon where, and the footnotes are kind of amusing at times, because they like there's a passage in the Book of Mormon where Nahum, who was a minor prophet, and there's of course the Book of Nahum, but there's a part where Nahum is mentioned, and you look at the footnote and it says Nahum, and then it gives a possible definition, and it says Nahum, consolation probably. So so they they're even the footnotes, if you read the footnotes of the book, it's hard to convince yourself that this is an inspired text. But getting back to what I was saying, Nauvoo, which was a city, and Joseph Smith Joseph Smith established his own sort of Praetorian Guard, which was the size, about a third the size of the U.S. military. Which, keep in mind, this was pre-Civil War, before conscription, and the military. The Nauvoo, the civil defense force he established, was around 8,000 people. So just think of that. There was a time when around 24 or 25,000 people, that was the extent of the U.S. armed forces. But he established this city in Nauvoo, and then ultimately Joseph Smith was killed, and Brigham Young took that collection of Mormons and moved to Utah. But if you look at the migration of Mormonism, even that is it's and their dedication to preserve their religion. Reading the Book of Mormon actually helps you understand that tendency. So that's something else. And there are other aspects of Mormon culture and life that I think reading the Book of Mormon helps you to understand a lot better. So in that respect, I don't think I, I've grown an appreciation for Joseph Smith, or the Book of Mormon as a sacred text. But in terms of, yeah, the Mountain Meadows massacre, there was it was essentially an ambush laid by the Mormons once they had migrated to the southwest. This was, and there's even a book there. Well, there are a couple of books on the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which are fascinating. I mean, the subject itself is very, very interesting because I think it's it's not helpful to look at it as Mormons. There was persecution, civil persecution by the authorities against Mormons, but on the other hand, there was also violence enacted by the leaders of Mormonism against non-Mormons, but also within Mormonism itself. There were, for example, Joseph Smith, particularly after he endorsed plural marriage and he began taking the wives of some of his followers, there was a schism that developed, and and he actually attacked or had dissenters attacked, and Brigham Young pursued this policy, and you see it in things like the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And yeah, there were there were American Indian tribes involved in that. It's kind of an interesting historical side note to this religion. But yeah, they, there are other aspects of Mormonism that are interesting that you can glean some insights from reading the Book of Mormon. But I'm probably going to go a little bit delve a little bit deeper into that in my videos where I specifically talk about this. I just wanted to give a little description. I thought this video would be much shorter, but now that I know that I can actually be heard, that the video is coming across clearly, I we got to chat for a little bit, which I appreciate. But I just want to thank everyone who came. HF, Richard, Irene, Tower Time, Nate, if he's still here, the super mod, and uh anyone else that is dropping by. Just like to thank everyone. Thank you for the feedback. And I'm glad that I the new year finally had a successful or semi-successful live stream. And I'll see you all later.